So hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining us on the second day of UN Behavioral Science Week 2024. So my name is Mary McLennan. We're moderating today's discussion on essentially how Foresight meets behavioral science. For those of you who haven't seen me in webinars before, I am the Senior Advisor on Behavioral Science to the Executive Office of the Secretary General. I also lead an initiative called the UN Behavioral Science Group, which I will come to shortly. So before we get into today's session, I just wanted to cover a little bit about Behavioral Science Week. So this week we bring together over 38 entities. So there's lots to unpack and explore, different behavioral science experiences across the UN. Here's the agenda. We'll put it in the chat for you shortly. There's lots to hear about, from gender through sustainability, health, peace and security. So lots to explore and still to come throughout the week. And I encourage you to check that out. So just before we get into the session, I just wanted to back up a little bit and speak about the UN Behavioral Science Group, as I mentioned. So we bring together over 5,000, close to 6,000 members from the UN and outside, from over 70 entities in 150 countries. So there's lots of interest and demand for behavioral science across the UN. Also wanted to flag here in relation to the topic of today's discussion that behavioral science is part of this UN 2.0 Quintet of Change. So this is a priority of the Secretary General and basically these 5 areas are important for the UN to be nimble and effective and really deliver on its ambitious agenda. So you'll see here behavioral science and foresight alongside innovation, digital transformation, and data. So it's about a forward-thinking culture and really changing the way the UN operates overall. So we'll explore the link between behavioral science and foresight today, but there's also much more to explore when it comes to the quintet, and we can share some of those links with you if you want to know more about work across the UN and UN 2.0. All right, so again, we can share some links with you regarding behavioral science resources in the UN. So we've produced a number of documents, including Secretary General's guidance note on behavioral science and a practitioner's guide to getting started with behavioral science. And then also, as mentioned, you can join the UN Behavioral Science Group. Whether you're inside the UN or outside the UN, there's a space for you to join the conversation and discussion. All right, okay, so now on to today's session. So what we'll have some opening remarks and then a panel of 3 speakers. You are welcome to ask questions to the opening remarks speaker, as well as any people on our panel. We ask that you put these questions in the Q&A box. So not in the chat, but the Q&A box. And we'll be taking questions from there. Even if you don't have a question yourself, you can upvote the questions of your colleagues. So hopefully you can check out the box and we can have a discussion about topics that most resonate with the audience with us today. All right, okay, so first I just wanted to back up a little bit and define behavioral science, because this conversation we're having today will be, as I said, at the intersection where behavioral science comes to meet strategic foresight. So I'll first define behavioral science, and then we'll hear a bit more about strategic foresight. So we define behavioral science across the UN as an evidence-based understanding of how people actually behave, make decisions, respond to policies, programs, and incentives. So often we design policies and programs in the UN and outside. We make assumptions about human behavior. We think people will act and do certain things for oftentimes good reason that we might think this way. But in the real world, we see this doesn't always happen or pan out. So what can we leverage from what we know about behavioral science to make our assumptions a bit more aligned with reality? So we basically think about behavioral science in 2 components of this definition. So the first is really leveraging principles and ideas from psychology, anthropology, sociology, economics, and thinking about, what do we know about human behavior? In a certain situation or context, can we maybe apply a social norm or a default or whatever it might be? And these concepts might seem a little bit obvious on the surface, but when we dive a bit deeper, how and when to apply them can be quite interesting and then oftentimes complex depending on the situation you're looking at. And then the second component of the behavioral science definition is that we test where possible. So although we know a lot about human behavior from the literature and practice over many years, it's really important that we also understand what works in the specific context in which we operate. So for instance, what works in Cape Town might not work in Buenos Aires, might not work in New York. So how do we really embed that into our thinking and understanding as we reflect upon behavioral science ideas? So that's a quick definition of behavioral science. I'm sure we'll dive much more into it throughout the discussion today. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker. So we're fortunate to have with us Chris Ernie, who I think many of you might be familiar with on the call, who's from the UN Futures Lab. So Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Mary. And morning to everyone. My, that is an old photo of me. Morning. I'm really pleased to participate in this intersection in this conversation because for me, I would argue that none of the Quintet of Change can be carried out in silos because the complexity that we're now facing is renders single approaches way too simply for the challenges of today and certainly for tomorrow. And this session is exciting because we're talking about how to do just that. So our goal today is to understand how these two powerful fields can complement and enhance each other, driving more effective and impactful strategies for the future. Of course, both behavioral science and strategic foresight explore complexity and both offer new, credible, and practical ways to address change and to bring about change itself. If we start by understanding what strategic foresight is, then it becomes somewhat of a no-brainer that it can be superpowered by using and incorporating behavioral science approaches, because behavioral science can significantly enhance strategic foresight processes by providing insights into how people perceive, interpret, and respond to what and how we think the future looks like. Foresight is not something that's new to human beings. It's just one set of tools and methodologies to think and organize our thoughts around the future. And thinking about the future is something that human beings have done forever. What color is the sky at night? What direction are the birds flying in? What direction are the oceans and seas, the waves traveling in? And so on and so forth. Foresight, in our definition, is an approach for systematically thinking and acting in a long-term and anticipatory way under conditions of uncertainty. And essentially what we're trying to do when we do strategic foresight is three things. The first thing we're trying to do is to understand change. We use a number of tools that help us to see signals of change. Understanding change is not a static event. It's something that we constantly need to be able to do. And this is the first intersection where I can see the first intersection of strategic foresight and behavioral science, because behavioral science promotes a culture of continuous learning and adaptation, which is essentially what we're trying to do when we're carrying out horizon scans, when we're trying to understand the trends and the changes around us. This means creating mechanisms for regularly updating and revising strategies based on new information and changing circumstances. The second thing we're trying to do with strategic foresight is to imagine what is possible, imagining alternative or preferred futures. We use tools such as scenario development to capture ideas, hopes, dreams, and aspirations. And behavioral science here can enhance our scenario planning by incorporating realistic human behaviors and biases into our models. Incorporating debiasing techniques such as pre-mortems, red teaming, and scenario planning exercises can be used to challenge assumptions and explore alternative solutions. Behavioral science provides the tools to design these techniques effectively. And then the third thing, of course, that we're trying to do is we're trying to turn insights into action. We're trying to affect the change. So we use tools such as backcasting, and these tools ultimately help to support decision-making. By understanding the psychological drivers behind decision-making, we can create interventions that encourage proactive and future-oriented thinking. So in this instance, thinking about behaviorally informed policies, using insights from behavioral science can be used to design policies and interventions that are more likely to be adopted and sustained, let alone all of the frameworks around decision-making itself. For structured decision-making, decision trees, multi-criteria decision analysis, and so on and so forth. We can integrate all of these tools and processes into foresight processes, and vice versa. If we were to open this conversation up, and if I were allowed to talk much longer, then I'd love to be able to listen to our participants on this panel to think about how foresight can be used in behavioral science itself. For me, that starts with thinking about how we can future-proof behavioral science strategies, how we can use foresight to anticipate the needs of our organizations when it comes to behavioral science moving forwards. So I'm going to stop here. There's way more intelligent people on this webinar who are going to impart some fascinating knowledge on us all from real-life experiences. So thanks for joining us today. Look forward to our engaging discussions and collaborative efforts. Back over to you, Mary, and for the rest of the webinar.
Great. Thank you very much for those remarks, Chris. Really insightfully outlining the linkages between behavioral science and foresight. There's lots here we can unpack and explore. This is a space that there's a lot more work to be done overall. And apologies for the photo. We'll get an updated one next. All right. Okay. So next over to our panel discussion. So now we're going to dive into some examples of where colleagues in the UN have explored this intersection that Chris has just referred to of with behavioral science and foresight. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panel of speakers. So first we'll hear from Ria Katsanakis from UNDRR, and she'll speak about some of the work they've been doing there, looking at foresight and embedding behavioral science into it. Rian Derrig from the World Maritime University, who reflect upon some of his work, particularly in the academic sphere, reflecting upon biases in human decision-making. And then Aaron Sittumarong from the UN Global Pulse, who's worked in foresight for many years, and he'll speak to some of the work that they've been doing, reflecting on ways to embed behavioral science. And then finally, Yusuf Nassif from UNFCCC, again, an organization that's very much focused on the future and ways we can understand it better and how they're embedding behavioral science into that as well. So with that, I'm going to stop screen sharing and turn it over to Rhea. Over to you.
Thanks, Mary, and welcome to everybody who's been joining today. Can you see my slides in full screen mode?
Yes, we can see them.
You can, okay. So I come from the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the way we started to think about behavioral science is that we are the focal point in the UN system that is managing risk and supposed to create resilience by keeping people safe through implementation of something that's called the Sendai framework. And what we noticed.
Hi, Ria. Sorry, just can I come a second? Could you speak a little louder, maybe? It's a little bit hard to hear you, or closer to your microphone. That'd be great. Thanks.
Is that better?
So I think so. Continue on.
Yeah, okay. So our first question was, at some point, we noticed that because we put a lot of focus on risk information and data, and then we noticed that people don't always act on that data. We wondered why it is that if you have top-notch risk assessments and risk modeling at hand, why would you not try to implement that information to create resilience for yourself? And we explored that in the Global Assessment Report 2022. And this is an example of what we found when we started to work with psychologists, behavioral scientists, and anthropologists. So there was an example of the Ebola outbreak in Liberia in 2014 and how it was very difficult to enforce the burial rights and manage risk during that Ebola outbreak because local communities were just strongly resisting the safe burial methods because there were doubts about the reality of Ebola, transmission pathways, and even what doctors were doing and if they were harming the community. So only when that was understood, and the Red Cross did a very good job there, they understood how the culture was impairing the implementation and then came up with strategies that would incorporate the cultural belief systems, and suddenly things changed and people were much safer. So we learned that human biases and decision-making impact disaster risk reduction outcomes. Because risk reduction is really a multi-step process, so people must be aware of the risk and decide that they're concerned by it, and that it's something they can do about it. And then they have to select a course of action. And at each stage of this process, biases and social motives influence the decision. So the challenge really for DRR in the 21st century is how to incorporate this awareness into our systems for risk assessment, risk communication, and planning. And if you look at this graphic, it really shows what happens mostly in terms of people when they're faced by risk or uncertainty. They have to make very quick decisions, and they often go to heuristics, which is a shortcut. And that is highly influenced by behaviors, by biases, and by social motives, while a conscious pathway is a slower but taking longer and a reasoned decision making. And this is where we want to get. However, it's easier said than done. And there's a famous quote by Ashish Jha from the Ministry of Health in the US when COVID happened. And they were talking about the preventable deaths, and they said we got the medical science right, but we didn't consider the social science. That was really one of the big mistakes in the looking backward. We then wanted to go from this understanding that behavioral science is influencing decisions about risk to action. So how do we try to apply this now in our work is that we, first example is the Words into Action guideline. That's a national guideline for risk assessment, and it will be launched in about 2 weeks. And it's a review actually. And in the review of the older document, we understood that we really had a blind spot in terms of behavioral science in many ways, so that we now wanted to try to integrate behavioral science into risk analytics, the root drivers analysis of risk. So where does this risk come from? Why are people vulnerable, etc. And then also how can I apply the findings to the action that I want to take. And really, in this risk assessment guide, we will be focusing on 3 areas where behavioral science can be useful in assessing risk. So one is the institutional bias, because institutions are run by people, and they're often driven by lenses colored by organizational priorities, cultures, and histories. So what happens then is an over-evaluation of particular risks and an undervaluation of other risks. And that can have catastrophic consequences for humans and plants. So behavioral science-based approaches of bias and from thinking can really help minimize these blind spots in the institution itself when it starts the business. Then in the vulnerability assessment of communities affected, traditionally, we do not include behavior of people into the vulnerability assessment. However, they may be vulnerable because of certain behaviors or resistance to, let's say, move out of a risky area, etc. So far it has been behavior blind, and we want to change that because it makes incorrect assumptions about the vulnerability of people. And the thirdly and lastly, when we want to then apply the risk assessment findings, we want to really get to something that focuses intervention not on incorrectly assuming that people all have the same ability to act. Because especially when there's communities that are faced with chronic uncertainty, such as refugee communities, etc., they have a different perception of risk. And I need to understand that when I'm developing my actions, because otherwise there's very little chance that those will be taken up in longer term. And that actually brings me already to the end of my slides. And I'll hand back.
Great, thank you for that, Raya. So colleagues have been remarking it's still a little bit challenging to hear you. So if you might want to, over the next few minutes, figure out your microphone before the Q&A, just so we can hear you a bit more clearly. But it is really insightful presentation about how you've been able to take just behavioral foresight thinking and embed different thinking when it comes to behavioral biases into it, when it comes to guidelines and just overall reflections. So if you would like to stop screen sharing, that would be great. Then we can get over to our next speaker. Thank you for that. So our next speaker is Rayan. Over to you.
Hi, thank you very much. I will share my screen. Okay. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you today. So to everyone in the audience, thank you so much for joining. And to the organizers, especially Mary and Joanna, thank you very much for the invitation to join this panel. I'm really, really pleased to have the opportunity to talk about the project I'm going to speak to you about today. That project is a research program we're undertaking at the World Maritime University in Malmö in Sweden. I'm a postdoctoral researcher there, and we're a university focused on postgraduate education in maritime and ocean affairs within the framework of the International Maritime Organization, IMO. Now, the research program I'm talking about is called the Future Ocean Program. It's a 4-year program led by a team of academic faculty and including postdoctoral and doctoral researchers. And it's funded by the Nippon Foundation. We're very grateful for their support. Now, we have just begun this program in the last month or so. So it's quite early days as of yet, and I don't have the possibility of talking to you about findings or examples of the sort that Rhea just very interestingly shared with us. But I can give you the outline of what we envisage and focus on the methods we hope to use and how they fall within an intersection between behavioral science and foresight, future-oriented thinking. Now, at the center of this research program is a new treaty. That's the 2023 agreement under the United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Sea on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. It's a very long name, which is why it's usually referred to as the BBNJ agreement. BBNJ standing for biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. It's also been called the Paris Agreement of the Ocean in kind of popular commentary in the news. This treaty was negotiated because it was widely viewed as necessary to clarify and make new commitments about what was required by a larger overarching treaty, and that's the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. It's the primary instrument that sets out the international law as it relates to the oceans. It's often called the Constitution of the Oceans. And the clarifying work undertaken by the BBNJ agreement, the agreement we're focused on in this program, was made necessary by a desire to use and conserve resources in areas of ocean that are not under the jurisdiction of any state. So those are areas, the water column of those areas would be the high seas. It also includes the seabed, which is a separate legal regime. And that amounts to about 64% of the surface of the world's oceans. The Future Ocean Programme has 4 pillars or thematic areas. I'll focus on the 4th here because it is of most interest to us today. I'll just briefly mention the preceding 3. The first, regime and institutional interactions, involves studying how this new treaty will and should interact with treaties governing overlapping topics. The second, non-state actors and rights-based approaches to protecting the ocean, involves studying the role of actors other than states, so like NGOs, civil society, in lawmaking processes that have traditionally been dominated by states. The third, ocean observation technologies, examines how these kinds of technologies, remote sensing technologies, which are increasingly important in ocean policy making, are regulated. And the fourth pillar is the one that I'd like to say a little bit more about today. That's a pillar that looks at alternative futures of ocean governance. So the aim of this pillar is to model alternative futures of ocean governance, to develop a novel interdisciplinary method to generate models like that, and to theorize how to intervene and guide behavior towards desired models or to avoid concerning models. And by governance models, I'm talking about things like institutional designs, legal instruments, how this treaty that we're quite focused on is practically implemented. Now, as I said, because the program is beginning, we have not developed this methodology yet. So I can try to concretize what we do have in mind, however, by referring to 2 examples that I hope might be illuminating. The first is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Many of you will probably have followed the work of this panel in the news and elsewhere. It projects future scenarios of global warming using natural science methods. And our reflection was that no comparable modeling or effort at strategic future-oriented thought is undertaking using social science methods in ocean affairs, although that would be quite useful. The second example I'll briefly mention is a past project in future studies that has been a source of inspiration for the Future Ocean Programme, and that's the World Order Models Project. It's often called WOMP. This was a global research network that existed between the 1970s and the 1990s. Now, it was very much a Cold War project. It was an attempt by academics to envision futures of harmonious geopolitics that transcended the bipolarity of the political moment, but aspects of its methods might be profitably revisited today. And very provisionally, to give you a sense of how we envisage those methods being used, we think of them as involving a focus on trends in social change, in policy making, in lawmaking, and as sketching out those trends by drawing on sociological and historical work, especially. We're also quite focused on using law and understanding how law can be used to achieve social change. The project is predominantly, it's interdisciplinary, but it has quite a legal center of gravity. We're also focused on economic forces and interests, as very important drivers of social change in the areas that we're looking at. I'll briefly conclude by noting an intersection between foresight or future-oriented thinking as we're deploying it and behavioral science. The Future Ocean Programme doesn't use some widely known behavioral concepts like nudges, but behavior change is very much a central object of inquiry. The methods we aim to develop will be evidence-based and will be engineered around the aim of influencing behavior for the better. So that's the point of intersection that we're focused on understanding and about which I'm delighted to speak to you today. I will stop there. Thank you so much. It has been a real pleasure to speak to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you for those remarks. I think we can unpack a bit more of the behavioral science part of what you've discussed in the behavioral components and some reflections there and the Q&A. Okay, so next over to our next speaker, who is Aaron from UN Global Pulse. Over to you. And also, maybe as Aaron joins, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. We will be taking them from there shortly. Aaron, over to you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you also, Johanna and your UNIT colleague for inviting us to this panel. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Aaron Sitomoran, the Social Systems Lead at UN Global Pulse. We're a UN Innovation Lab under the UN Secretary General. I'm excited to share with you about our ongoing experiment on incorporating strategic foresight principles and tools to support behavioral science work. So before I continue, let me share my screen. Okay. So in starting this experiment, we start by looking at the challenges around doing behavioral science work. Experts in the field have highlighted several issues. For example, Michael Hausworth in the IT Manifesto talks about the need for the field to evolve to fulfill its potential. Usara also emphasized the importance of understanding the systems around these behavioral science interventions. And also one of the resources that we use for this experiments is from Ruth Smith, who discussed about brittleness in doing behavioral science work. While at the other hand, as Chris mentioned also earlier, strategic foresight is basically a structured approach to help us to be more anticipatory and be more prepared in facing uncertainty. Through foresight, we can explore different possible futures, so we can go back to the present and make better decisions today. Usually, the methods that we use on foresights are usually around using first horizon scanning to spot trends and changes early on. We usually do systems mapping to show how different parts of the systems interact. We then continue with doing scenario exercise to help us imagine and plan for various future scenarios to then go back to the present using backcasting. So this is our experiments. Believes that there are several points where strategic foresight could help provide better behavioral science experiments. At UN Global Pulse, we integrate all quintets of change into our work. In the past, we've delivered projects utilizing behavioral science and foresight, but these projects were not interlinked. Through our behavioral science project, Beyond Sticky Floor, which was presented in last year's Behavioral Science Week, we wanted to understand why women running small businesses struggle in adapting to new technology. We used behavioral science lens and found that the fear of change and lack of confidence were major barriers. And we also grouped these respondents into 4 main archetypes, from the tech anxious to the tech practitioner. And on the other hand, the second study was called the Features of MSMEs in Indonesia. So in this Foresight project, we apply horizon scanning, which was the initial phase of strategic foresight. We did this horizon scanning activities with colleagues from Finland and also the Ministry of Planning in Indonesia to see what might shape the future of MSMEs in Indonesia. From the exercise, we have identified 5 main drivers of change, as you can see on the screen, from climate change, new technology, emerging sectors, and the shift in consumer preference. We're also happy that the insights were used to inform Indonesia's national long-term planning development plan. So after being exposed and doing this foresight exercise, our mindset shifted a bit and led us to rethink our previous study using behavioral science, which is the Beyond Sticky Floor. And we asked several important questions like, what do these drivers of change and trends mean for the future of technology for micro and small businesses? With all these new tech coming, would all of our archetypes that we've identified still be relevant in the future? Would their challenges remain the same? And how would these new tech impact these different groups? So after that, we experiment by Foresight practitioner likes to use this term. So clashing these 2 studies and approaches, where we took 2 drivers of change from the Foresight study, and we took 2 archetypes from the behavioral science study, which is the Beyond Sticky Floors. We took the tech and business drivers and also the rise of emerging sectors, while from the Beyond Sticky Floor, we took to experiment 2 archetypes, the tech anxious and also the tech apprentice. We use a tool which is called the Futures Wheel to understand the potential of implications, both direct and indirect, of specific driver, events, or issue. So this is where we actually combine these 2 approaches and studies. So for example, in the drivers of change that will influence MSMEs in the future, we ask, by using Futures Wheels, we ask what would be the implication for the tech anxious, and what will be the second layer implication, and what would be the third layer. So for example, like if there's new ways of working or new technologies for MSMEs in the future, for the tech anxious, there might be increasing anxieties, and the second layer of impact, they could even their business cannot stay afloat because they're very worried and doesn't know how to adapt to more progressive technologies. While for the second archetype, the tech apprentice, they might be the one who could still adjust and learn new technologies. So when we were doing the Beyond Sticky Floors, this was not something that we foresee, but after doing Foresight, we kind of like are encouraged to think longer terms. What would be not just the present, but what would be the future implications of emerging technologies informed by the futures of MSMEs study. There are also other tools that we could try. For example, the scenario exercise. This could be very relevant for longer term thinking. Like if the rise of emerging sectors and new technologies benefit MSMEs, then who could utilize those progress? It might be tech apprentice, but what about the tech anxious? Maybe not so if there's not support provided to these type of archetypes. In addition to the 2 tools I've mentioned, Foresight also provides other methods that could support behavioral science practice, such as systems mapping, which could see the unintended consequences and the complexity of certain issues. So this is the steps of doing behavioral science. The above one was developed by Mary and the team, and the below one was developed by BIT. So basically, this is talking more technical. These are the steps, the phases where Foresight could actually complement behavioral science when doing the exploration, the finding of the solutions, and also trialing the interventions. So to wrap up, mixing strategic foresight with behavioral science offer another way of solving complex problems. It helps us to stay relevant and adjust our strategies for the future. when we conducted the Beyond Sticky Floor around 2021, tools like ChatGPT didn't exist. And technology back then, I remember, was mostly about social media for marketing their business. But as we experience now, things have changed a lot. So combining these two approaches help us develop more inclusive, anticipatory, and systematic interventions. And if you're interested in pursuing this experiment forward, please reach us to us at Global Pulse. Thank you for your attention, and now I'll hand it over to Mary.
Great, thank you for that, Aaron. As well, it goes for all the speakers. If you want to put the links in the chat, or we can share them with panelists after as well. And thank you for that example. I think it really nicely illustrates how the methods can come together. The future's wheel, it's not a way we often think about in behavioral science. We don't think about the different orders of behaviors like that. And I really liked your emphasis as well on systems. This is one thing in the behavioral science community we've been thinking about a lot, whether we change individual behavior or within the systems. There's been a paper over the last few years been debated by the community called the I and S frame. So I think this could be one way we address some of those issues that we've been debating in the community, is reflecting upon Foresight in the ways that that you've outlined. So thank you for that. All right, so keep your questions coming in the Q&A box. Some of them have been answered. We'll come back to them all at the end. We have one final speaker for today, Yusuf from UNFCCC. Please come in. Thank you, Yusuf, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Mary, for convening us here. This is actually quite exciting, and so happy to hear the input from all the colleagues. Now, dealing with climate change presents us with a very interesting use case where you actually have to achieve a certain outcome, which is a climate safe world, by a certain date. So the science gave us till 2030 to transform, and hasn't really told us transform to what exactly, what are the tenets of that transformation and how. So what we're working on in this field is at the confluence of behavioral science and foresight on the one hand, but also transformation, resilience, and urgency on the other hand, plus a changing backdrop of evolution of frontier technology that requires rethinking all of this as we move forward. And we just heard from our final speaker about ChatGPT, which wasn't there a year ago, and yet now is influencing a lot. So what's coming next? What's coming next? And I think so we have a practical application of these concepts, neither of which can be taken in isolation. So no siloing here, to try to address a wicked problem and finding that type of the opposite of the wicked problem from the side of a solution. So something just as equally intricate to enable the world to move collectively towards a desired landing zone in the end. So trying to induce a paradigm shift within a very short period of time, in which the largest transformation will be in mindset and behavior. It's not really that we need new technologies, but a change in assumptions, in behavior, in worldview, mindset, maybe even values. So this is really the backdrop. So there's a thinking component to it and an acting component, as is in all aspects of behavioral science. So when we were told by the science that we have 1 decade to transform, and noting that the multilateral process dealing with climate change evolves incrementally, you don't have a decision coming out 1 year that says, okay, next year the whole world will transform towards something very, very different, that the fossil fuel age is over and the industrial revolution age is over, and now we're in this other age and here's how it would be. So we don't have that. And so the first step in this was to create a forum for thinking. And this is where the Resilience Frontiers Initiative came in, which is something I launched back in 2018, had the first convening of experts moderated by a number of strategic foresight experts in 2019, April. And it was instigated first by a conversation with Riel Miller in UNESCO, where then we started developing a hybrid methodology between futures literacy and something called the moonshot approach. So you have both the exercise that people go through to rid themselves of assumptions and be ready for opening up their minds, as was described by Chris in the opening, but also an exercise building loosely on backcasting to enable visioning the landing zones that we want to go. This was a massive exercise with experts from the technology field, experts from all sectors, water, health, etc., and institutional setups. This holistic approach looked at a whole range of types of changes needed, whether behavioral or otherwise, but also landing zones and parallel trajectories together, described in what we call resilience pathways. And there's many lessons that I'll get to from these exercises. We've used many of the tools that were reflected in this meeting, but also created new ones. So we've tried to make this the most comprehensive foresight exercise possible, but then taking account that we have this notion of urgency, where we have a timeline and how to deal with the need for accelerating change. So then we were really informed by the notion of black swans, events that come out that are unpredictable, but they do change trajectory. They create paradigm shifts. And then we have a methodology group that is actually working on codifying how to measure the likelihood of an action to have the effect of a black swan. Because in order to institute that change within a decade, we need to be able to identify these types of events. We call them blue swans, blue because we're UN, and also because they wouldn't be unpredictable. They would be planned. So we'll identify specific actions that serve as first mover activities to launch a sort of a flywheel effect that can help us make these landing zones materialize. With time, this exercise evolved. So we have 3 advisory groups, one specifically dealing with behavioral science called the Impact Advisory Group. It's finished its work. Very good insights there. We're preparing the outcome, which is guidance to the groups that will do the prioritization of action. There is a methodology group that is working on that prioritization engine that will tease out the actions that would qualify best as first mover actions. Typically very unlikely ones that would unlock that first step that would then unlock more steps. This is totally new knowledge, so we have very good thinkers on this methodology. It's not using anything that already exists. The third group looks at technology, the implications of frontier technologies, both those in the pipeline and those expected, but not in a linear way, but looking at, okay, what does this technology and that technology imply if they evolve together in a way that would have enabled you back in 1990 to see that the future of the phone and the future of the camera overlap. And so this type of thinking is one that we're trying to instill in the technology group, because that's a moving target, and any thinking that we have for 2030 might become totally defunct if we're not ready for that technological change happening in the background. So we have these 3 advisory groups pushing the envelope of knowledge there, and 8 pathway groups. I told you there are 8 landing zones, some relating to water, some relating to learning, some relating to money. What does it mean in the future? Prosperity, some relating to habitats, neighborhoods, transboundary aspects, relationship with nature. So a lot of descriptions of new systems. We don't assume that systems existing today will continue to exist in the future, but the paradigm shift may require different components from different systems to form new relationships, and we're open to thinking about that rather than be constrained with a cognitive bias that limits us to what we understand system components to be today. So a food system may not exist in the future. It might be a different type of system, or it might be called a food system, but entailing things other than what today's food system entails. So this thinking is going on. We have a listing of what we call bright lights. which is initiatives that are already there, startups that no one may have heard of already, but that satisfy the criteria of living within that transformed world that we are thinking of. It's almost like living in 1979 and seeing that tiny little computer company called Apple and being able to see, hey, that company, as opposed to Commodore and Tandy and Sinclair and etc., is more attuned to what we think the future will bring, and be able to identify that early and nourish it. So this is one thing we're looking at. So we have like around, I think, 400 bright lights, all kinds of things, from policies to startups to NGOs to specific laws. For example, countries giving legal personality to rivers. Something like that is quite consistent with some of the tenets of the future world we're looking at. Now, some insights that have emerged that I want to share with you. We focused last year on the creative arts and their role. And a very good set of outcomes there is, number one, it's a shortcut to breaking down complex notions. I mean, we talked about climate change like a wicked problem, but the solution could be equally complex, or the future world, the definition of the future world. We really need art in its different forms to be able to easily reach people with that vision. It also allows immersion, allows discovery and playing around with the vision much easier than if it was words on a piece of paper. We found that it can also inspire emotional aspiration towards the vision, which is definitely needed, and at the same time activate the desire for initiating and habituating action, so maintaining it as a habit later. So we have come to learn something which we didn't realize in the beginning, that art is probably one of the most powerful tools that we will have to use as a conduit to that rapid transformation. We found that the power of positive messaging is far bigger than that of negative messaging. Telling people climate change is going to kill you if you don't do something reminds me of just telling people that smoking kills and didn't make any difference. But actually selling, not just selling, but co-creating that vision of a desirable future that does not necessarily emanate from a need to undo harm or solve a problem, but rather just create something new. And being cognizant that creating that something new does not need to actively destroy an existing system. I always use the example that the automobile didn't seek to destroy the horse-driven carriage. It was just a better idea. And so changing the system about transformation, that it's not necessarily a change that has to emerge from specific setups today, but rather could entail creating some parallel setups that eventually become mainstreams. Then the biggest challenge that we are seeing from a climate change perspective is a cognitive bias, which is relating to short-termism. And we've discovered that there are three types. There's political short-termism, very clear. You know, electoral cycles are short and they induce certain priorities that may discount the benefits from longer-term action versus shorter-term action. There's economic short-termism. We actively teach students to do cost-benefit analysis using discount rates, so effectively destroying intergenerational equity in the process, because even accounting for inflation, you still discount the value of future costs, future benefits versus those in the short term. And that is really detrimental for climate change thinking, which is long-term. And third is psychological short-termism. And studies have shown that when we think of our future self, we actually see it in the same way that we see a different person. So the empathy we have for our future self is much less than the empathy we have to our current self. So these cognitive biases work so much against prioritizing action today that is necessary, and if delayed could be detrimental to the existence of humanity. And so these are some of the lessons that we have learned, and we will continue to work on this. We are happy to collaborate with any of you. Just get in touch with me, and with this I return to you, Mary. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Yusuf. Really interesting insights in terms of some of the behavioral science principles on habit formation, also reflecting upon the framing of messages from positive or negative framing and the impact that might have, as well as discounting and how we see that as humans. And I think there's a lot we can reflect upon here, the different contexts and when and how we can form habits, also which element of short-termism is most relevant, and can run experiments around this too. Positive framing, loss aversion, they're all concepts you can unpack and explore in the work. So thank you for highlighting those. All right, okay, so in the last few minutes here, we have some time for some questions. Some of them have been answered already, but maybe I'll speak to a few of them. So initially there were some questions around behavioral science and what it is regarding behavioral economics, social behavior change. So just to kind of clear that up. So behavioral science is this broader umbrella term that we're using. So at the start, I mentioned it's psychology, sociology, anthropology, and economics. So behavioral economics is sort of a subset under behavioral science as we see. So it's a bit more specific, but it is very much related to how we think about behavioral science. So happy to explore that if you want to go deeper there. Social and behavior change is an area of work that's been going on for many years that predates behavioral science. So it's generally about behavior change. Where behavioral science adds value is that we go a little bit deeper into the context to really understand different factors that might be at play. But that being said, lots of social and behavioral change teams in the UN are now actually applying behavioral science. So that barrier and that boundary is getting a little bit more blurred. I see also there are some questions about Foresight and the Futures Lab and where to get engaged. So Chris has put in some of the questions I can put in the chat as well. There's the UN Futures Lab website. There's also a Foresight community of practice if you'd like to join that as well. All right, so there are a few questions that have come through, but maybe one general one for everybody here about okay, let me just see. One general one here, which has been answered, but I think it kind of relates to just overall thinking in Foresight. So there's a question from Ashwini about how do you factor in wildcards and other high impact or low impact probable uncertainties in your decision making. So I think this kind of gets at the crux of Foresight. But just generally speaking from an overview, does anybody want to answer that question? I think Rhea did already, but anybody want to come in with a comment about how you factor in wildcards? I mentioned Black Swan, Yusuf. Anyone want to comment on that idea? Please come in. Turn your cameras on, everybody. This is the Q&A now. Ray, do you want to elaborate on your response to that question, maybe, about how you factor in wildcards?
So, do you hear me better now?
Yes,
I'm sorry,
it's
I
better
didn't
now.
use that before. So from our perspective, really, especially when you have high uncertainty and it's things that you cannot really model, it's very difficult to prepare for that, or at least that's how it always seems. It's this kind of very daunting future. But I think in those cases, usually what you can do is still work on the exposure and the vulnerability and reduce those, because that is really what is known and what is also where you have agency as a government or as an individual. While the hazard may be unpredictable, but you still can create resilience, and that usually gives you a better head start when it comes to impacts.
Does anybody want to comment on that broader question as well? It relates to the fundamentals of Foresight, but I'm going to answer it. Yeah, come in, Chris, please.
Mary. Yeah, no, I mean, look, when we're looking at how we incorporate wildcards into the Foresight process, there's probably a few different areas that we look at. First of all is identifying the wildcards themselves, and there's a really important piece to this, which is making sure that our processes and systems can embrace a diversity of thought and perspective to make sure that our Foresight processes are inclusive. Otherwise, there's a real danger that we're going to be missing very important wildcards. Second thing that we would do with wildcards is develop scenarios around them. So how can we integrate the wildcards into our scenario processes and exercises? Third thing is using wildcards in stress testing. So particularly on the scenario analysis or looking at adaptation strategies. This is really where we bring wildcards into the Foresight process. And then the last thing that I would say is, if we're doing Foresight in continuously, then making sure that we've got signal detection, making sure that we've got processes in place that can be adaptable, that can really be updated when it comes to those scans, and then that's a really important aspect of what we do. And then the last thing, I suppose, is around communication and engagement. So how do we engage broad groups of stakeholders to communicate the importance of considering wildcards into various different decision fora? Over to you.
Great, thanks for that, Chris. And I think another question just came in about how you engage with communities and the methods that you use. So you kind of answered that a little bit already. Okay, so next over to Rian. Did you want to comment on this question as well?
Yes, just something that I wanted to briefly add was that perhaps an important response to addressing the risk or kind of imagined situations that wildcards are a prospect of would be thinking about whether you're talking about structural or individual, kind of unique and individual events. I was struck by Yusuf's example of blue swans, which seem to largely describe structural change. And at the same time, at the individual level, you might be thinking about individual behavior in which situation and which context wildcards would look different. Just a brief. Thanks.
Great, thanks for that, Rian. And I'll put in the chat, someone also asked about that paper, the I and the S frame paper regarding systems and individual behaviors. I'll put that in the chat now. Aaron, over to you.
Yes, I'll just add briefly to the previous speaker. So I think in processing wildcard, I see Foresight as a very inclusive and collaborative process. So I think the following step should be a lot of collaborative discussions. You can do more in-depth literature review to go to the wildcards and also do experts consultations. And I think all these efforts could help reduce the personal bias of people doing the scanning for Foresight.
Great, thanks for that, Aaron. And I think another question that came through, which maybe would be helpful to unpack a little bit, was actually targeted toward Aaron, but I think it comes back to a lot of the methods around Foresight, was around how you developed your personas, Aaron. I think you've answered it already, but just for everyone to hear a little bit more. The question was around, how did you do this? A bit more to unpack that. You answered the question already. You're happy to elaborate on it, but were they used within communications or participatory policy or governance planning? How was the work received? So ultimately, what happened with it as well? So maybe just unpacking a bit around developing personas and what ultimately resulted in that in your work. Aaron, and then everyone to comment on the use of personas overall.
Thank you, Mary. So when we develop the personas, we use several variables to shape the four personas. Basically, like the biases, the challenges for them in adapting to new technologies. So yeah, that's the main variables basically to in developing the personas. It was a qualitative study. We had around, I think, 40 respondents of micro and small women business owners. It was done especially during the COVID-19, where technology was supposed to help a lot in navigating the challenges during COVID. So yeah, so basically that's how we came up with the personas. But it was an more of internal studies where we, the team at Global Pulse did it ourselves, and we didn't have a chance because again it was during the COVID-19. We didn't have a chance to collaborate intensely with external stakeholders, but we did disseminate the studies through various channels. Thank you.
Great, thanks for that, Aaron. So I think we're at time, but if we have a few more minutes with the speakers, we can continue on if you're able to stay with us for maybe a few more 5 more minutes or so. Great, so Rhea, over to you.
I think if you design any interventions and you plan for interventions, it's so important to understand the people that these interventions are for. And I think this is really where these personas that Aaron just mentioned can be so helpful, because you can really then see what are the different types of behavioral barriers that could be existing that will be undermining my action, right? And then I can target my action and tailor them specifically to that community. I think that's very, very helpful.
Great. All right. So any other comments on that and just developing different scenarios or personas? No. All right. So there's maybe another question here, which kind of alluded to earlier, but I think it's an important one about how do we engage with communities? So participatory or action research methods. So how do you actually engage with people and communities, both in terms of as you develop your work to get the insights you need to reflect upon human behavior in the future? How do you do that? And then maybe also too, how do you apply it, engaging with communities as well? So reflections there on how you interact with people to get your insights. Yes, Yusuf, over to you.
Yeah, well, there's sort of a two-tier answer to this. So when we're dealing with change, say at ground level, you start realizing that all of what we're talking about is quite context specific and culture specific. So I'll give you a particular example from adaptation. We were trying to prioritize adaptation actions. And then you find one community in a flood refuses to move when the government tells them there is a flood coming because the ants have not moved first. And in their knowledge, their assumptions based on a lot of experience in the past centuries, that was the telltale sign. So culturally, they found it difficult to accept that things have changed. Another community, tribal community, refused to also accept adaptation action because it said, okay, you're telling us this is in response to how humanity ruined the world. And so we see this as a punishment that we have to accept and not fight, or else it will come in another form. So I think context specificness and understanding the underlying values are a really important starting point before trying to institute change, because then you won't get the starting point correctly. Now, in our macro level, where we do the whole global transformation, it's a bit different because you deal with changes that all communities would see as desirable. So everyone will be resilient in water resources and food, etc. So that cultural component is not as prominent. And so in that regard, we're good with engaging scientists and experts, etc., as opposed to when we're dealing with the lower you get at the level of engagement, the less important the role of science becomes. I mean, unfortunately, that's the truth, because you really have to look at the priorities of the people and their beliefs and where they want to be later, not where we want them to be. So that's just a starting point for the discussion. Back to you.
Apologies. Thank you for that, Yusuf. Lots to unpack there. But unfortunately, I think we've reached the end of today's session. Lots of conversation that can be had to explore this intersection further. So thank you very much to our panelists for joining us and for sharing their remarks and their insights when it comes to behavioral science and foresight. Hope to continue this discussion as we go forward. There were some questions about sharing in the chat links to your work, and I think most of it's there. But if you have any follow-up, feel free to message us. As well, the recording will be on our YouTube playlist. That was also a question that we received a lot. So if you want to share with colleagues, you'll be able to do that there. So thank you very much for joining us and for being part of Behavioral Science Week 2024. Looking forward to continuing discussion. Thanks.